podcast includes commentary and conversations about issues relevant to clinical psychology. It is intended to educate, entertain, and enlighten, and is not a substitute for actual mental health treatment. Individuals who share personally here choose willingly to tell their stories to benefit you, the listener. All other references to clinical situations are altered or limited to protect confidentiality. For more specific questions or help with a personal situation, please consult a local mental health professional. Therapy, mental health, real life. This is Psych Rally with Los Angeles-based clinical psychologist Dr. Martin Shaw.
Okay, welcome all, and thank you for tuning back into the rally. This is episode 26, and just a reminder, you can subscribe or listen in on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, Google Play, or your Podbean app, and you can always visit the podcast website and show notes here at psychrallypodcast.com. Today, we're all really fortunate to have Noelani Jai, my guest, who will be talking about trichotillomania, which is now also known as hair pulling disorder. But I wanted to give just a little bit of a background on this issue since it's something that we do help a lot of people with here at the CBT Center of Southern California. And yet, I think it's something that I know my sense is there's relatively less or little awareness about, both in the general public and my sense is even within the therapist and clinical psychology community, it's definitely something that's known, a known issue by name, but clinical experience and expertise is relatively more rare. Trichotillomania, or TRIC, as we often call it, is a form of what we call a body-focused repetitive behavior, or BFRB. And essentially, BFRB, when we say that, is any a self-grooming habit or behavior that is repetitive, but that can also result in some damage to any part of one's own body. So TRIC is one example, right, when involving pulling hair that can be from one's scalp, from eyelids or eyelashes, or anywhere else on the body. But for other people, it may also mean picking or scraping one's skin, scabs, cuticles, biting one's nails, biting the inside of one's cheek. And this is what we now call excoriation disorder, sometimes skin picking disorder, or dermatillomania. These are things that statistically tend to have an onset around middle school, typically around ages 11 to 13, and at least statistically by report tends to be very heavily girls and women predominantly reporting these kinds of challenges, but there may be lots of different reasons as to why that statistic is what it is. Of course, we're going to hear a very personal story here from Nalani in a second, but just one other thing I want to say is that, TRIC is something that a lot of people describe as actually feeling very, in the moment, rewarding and soothing in a sense when people are feeling anxious or bored or lonely, but then, of course, afterwards it can cause a lot of feelings of frustration and shame and sort of a desire to isolate, both from having followed through on one urge as well as potentially the aftermath and the changes in appearance it can cause to one's body or one's hair. Many people talk about how that when they pull or pick, that they'll do that kind of when they're distracted in the middle of doing something else, while driving, watching TV, playing on their phone, but they're kind of able to stop when they catch themselves or become aware of that urge or that they're doing it. But for many other people, that urge can be so strong that even when they become aware of it, they may still act on that urge at times and really spend a lot of time pulling or picking and have that habit be the center of attention. So you can really imagine how difficult it can be for someone who's struggling with this, especially when people around you or society in general may not always, or if at all, really understand how difficult it is to stop. So I would like to welcome, and I'm very grateful to have Nalani join us today. And Nalani, aloha.
Aloha to you, Martin.
I say aloha because Nalani is native Hawaiian, right?
I actually have Hawaiian blood.
Have Hawaiian blood. Do we know how much?
Oh, enough to fill my pinky. Just about that.
Okay.
The rest is Chinese and German and Dutch. So I'm not atypical. I'm not unusual for a person from the islands.
That's right. Yes. And how long have you live here now in California? Yeah.
Well, I went to college here as well as law school here. So I was here for about 13 years when I was younger, and we've been back now for about 16 years. So in between those times, I've lived in Michigan, and Hawaii, of course, is where I grew up.
Gotcha. Okay. And what are you up to now generally, so people know who you are, and then we can talk about what your experience and understanding of trichotillomania.
I'm currently a family life pastor at a Foursquare church in Huntington Beach, California. And my husband and I are about to launch a church out of there called Jesus House in Westminster, California, which is where we moved to a couple of years ago.
All right. Starting a new church, that can't be an easy endeavor. So wishing you best of luck. Not for the
faint of heart. Thank you.
It's a leap of faith. Yes.
Yes.
So talk briefly about your experience and understanding of trichotillomania, and then we can kind of go back to how all this started for you a little bit.
Sure. Well, everything that you said at the top there was absolutely accurate. And it's really amazing to me, even in the day and age of the internet, that more people are not connected or aware of this disorder. So I'm very grateful that you're doing a program on this. Anything that we can do to bring awareness will decrease the isolation and the shame for those who are still suffering in silence or thinking that they're the only ones with this disorder and therefore thinking that they're crazy.
That's the idea, yes. And anyone can judge for themselves from listening to Noelani talk as someone who has dealt with this issue as to whether she is quote-unquote crazy or not, right?
Hopefully. We're all crazy.
Aren't we all? Right. So when did you first learn about the term or this issue, trichotillomania?
Strangely, it was a comedy show called Doogie Howser MD. Do you remember that show?
Oh, yeah, that's right.
I believe I was in my 20s, and I remember there was a patient of Dr. Doogie Howser, was a man in his 20s or 30s who had pulled and eaten the hair. So he had a disorder called trichotillomania, I believe. And after that program, I looked it up. And because it didn't sound exactly like what I had, which was trichotillomania, and because he was a man and he had a hairball basically in his stomach, I didn't relate. And so I kind of dropped any pursuit of what this disorder was and went back into my so-called trick closet and kept it secret from everybody, including my husband.
So Doogie Howser, even though it didn't exactly hit the nail on the head for you, the fact that they were drawing some attention to a related issue was actually pretty ahead of its time, yeah?
Correct. Okay. Yes.
Yeah, this is before we knew how multi-talented Neil Patrick Harris really was.
That's right.
Before the stage career, I think. And so that was first you heard of something similar, but kind of dropped it.
I didn't connect with the character in the show at all. So I don't know if it was just his gender, the fact that he had something where he was actually in the hospital because the hair was ingested and stuck and causing a life-threatening situation for him. But I just couldn't relate. And frankly, I don't know if I was ready to understand at that time what I had. And so personally, I don't believe it was time for me to face this head on. But it was something that I tucked away into my subconscious. And when I did realize that I had trichotillomania, I did recall looking it up after that show in my dictionary. This is pre-internet, of course.
So, but this was something that you had been dealing with for some time.
That's correct. Since I was 13 years old.
13. Okay. And can you recall when it started? Like, was this, I'm assuming, something you did in private? Was it something that you would spend a long time doing, or did it start as kind of just a funny little habit?
I think all of us with trichotillomania remember the first hair that we pulled, for better or for worse. I was bored. My parents were in a store, and they had been in there for quite a bit of time. And so I had long hair at the time, well down past my waist. And I was sitting in the car and fiddling with my hair and pulled out a single hair and saw that it had a follicle on the end. And I'd never noticed one before. And so then I kind of silly stuck the hair on the roof of the car and let it kind of hang because the follicle stuck it to the roof. And I proceeded to do that again and again until they came back into the car. And then I grabbed the hair off the roof and put it on the floor. But that night and in the subsequent days, I found that I couldn't stop pulling.
Yeah.
I was somewhat obsessed with the follicle, for sure. I remember rubbing it on my cheek. That's not an unusual behavior to do something with the follicle. And but I couldn't stop. And probably within the week, I had a quarter-sized bald spot on the top of my scalp. And became pretty concerned at that point that I wouldn't be able to stop. Still, no one knew.
So you had, when you started pulling at that point, was it pretty much all from that one spot on your head? Is that why there was that quarter-sized area?
That's correct. It was from the one spot. What I've noticed over the years, and what a lot of us with trichotillomania, all of us really report, is that when there's some irritation on your scalp, which you can definitely create by pulling, that's the spot that gives you the most gratification in the pulling. It feels almost like a mosquito bite that you just have to scratch. And so if you keep pulling from that same spot that's irritated, it gives the highest gratification in the anticipation and then the pulling of the hair. Of course, the aftermath is a different story.
Right. Yeah. So, but and as you said, if people can liken it to feeling an itch or something, a bug bite or something, sometimes the scratching it is relieving for a second, but it actually can even worsen or exacerbate the feeling of itchiness and wanting to do it again. Yeah.
Exactly. It's a vicious cycle.
So it's funny. I can picturing that image you described being in the car, and
sheer boredom.
Sheer boredom. Okay. From what you recall, weren't necessarily stressed or nervous or anything.
No, and most of us will report that the first hair was sometimes out of stress, but usually out of boredom, or it could even be, particularly for face pullers who pull eyelashes or eyebrows, it can be in science class in middle school when the teacher asks you to pull an eyelash out and put it under the microscope. And so I told my kids, because there is a genetic component probably, I told my own children, if you ever get asked to pull an eyelash for a science class, borrow your neighbor's. Just don't even pull one hair, just in case.
Yeah, mom has a history, so...
Exactly.
Be wary. When your parents came back in the car, was what I read into that or heard in that is, I don't know if there was sort of an intuitive, this would look funny if they saw the hairs, so I better get rid of them and put them somewhere they won't notice on the floor.
Yes, and that's when my trick closet of shame kind of started.
I see. Yeah, because for a moment it was pretty innocent. There was a fascination with this thing that just came from my body. But then I was playing with it and like, I don't want someone to see this or something. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Can you describe for someone who may be unfamiliar with this, what is that fascination? Like, as you said, you pulled a hair, people lose hair all the time, but you were just kind of playing around, you were bored, and you saw the follicle on the tip of the hair, and there was some fixation on that or something about that was really caught your attention. What is it about that really just was new and captivating for you?
Well, I think the fact that I'd never seen a follicle before. We all lose hair throughout the day, but we don't usually see the end of it like that. But the vicious cycle, or sort of what happens in in one's mind is the obsession with the follicle grows and grows. And so you want to get a bigger follicle, a kind of a juicier, plumper follicle. If you've irritated your scalp enough, sometimes the follicle has some blood on it. And so there's almost this passion to get a better and better follicle, a longer one, a plumper one. And until you get that one,
right.
And even when you do get that one, it's almost impossible to stop. It feels like there's a magnet on your fingertips and a magnet on your scalp, and you just can't stop going for it, for that follicle.
I hear that so often when people sort of say, no, I know I probably should stop, and I'm aware that I'm doing it, but I want to get that perfect one that's going to feel or look just right. And then at least the idea is, well, then I can stop for now. But
That's
even
correct.
then, it may or may not be that easy. Yeah?
That's correct. Exactly.
So that was what you recall as the sort of first hair that really, kicked off this habit for you. Yeah. And how did things progress from there for you?
Well, I had very thick, being Hawaiian, very thick, wavy hair. And what happened was, probably, if I look at photographs, definitely by 9th grade. So this was 8th grade that I started pulling. Definitely by 9th grade, my hair looked very thin, and I started having, because I pulled not only from the top, but the back and sides. So I had a number of spots by 9th grade, and I had to start wearing clips and side parts in order to cover the damage on the crown of my head, primarily with clips. And so the clips can actually cause irritation on your scalp. And so that became problematic, and those spots then became ones that were hard to keep my hands out of. And if I look at pictures of myself over those early years, I went from having a very thick head of long Hawaiian-looking hair and bangs, very full set of bangs, to having very wispy bangs and very, very thin hair overall. So by my senior year of high school, in order to get a little more body in my hair, I cut it to just beyond my shoulders, and that made it a little healthier and thicker. But that was a sad day. I loved having long hair, and I didn't like to have to cut it just so it wouldn't look so straggly.
And that was a decision you made mainly to hide the result of this habit, not as I'm going to do something different to, it's a new style or something,
No, it was right before senior prom and senior photos that I did that.
I see. Yeah. So it was sort of a way to compensate. It covered up a little bit and served that purpose.
Yeah, I mean, I always felt like people would notice throughout high school. Sometimes you'll be sitting in the gymnasium at an assembly, and the girls behind you will start playing with your hair, and that's normal girl behavior, grooming each other, and I would freeze, so afraid that they would see a bald spot underneath anywhere. And generally speaking, I took a lot of energy and effort and emotional energy to hide what I was doing. I'd have nightmares about not being ready for my carpool the next morning because I hadn't covered up my bald spot successfully. And nowadays there are products and things you can put on to kind of mask your bald spot so it's not so shiny and obvious. But I wasn't that sophisticated, and really all I was doing was trying to cover it with a clip and keep my hair that I did have in place. By my senior year, though, my part was probably down to my left ear, maybe only an inch and a half above my left ear. So that's a pretty big side part to wear. And I felt extremely ugly. I thought for sure people knew about it. Turns out they didn't. Even my best friend, when I shared years later, said, Well, I always thought your hair looked weird, but I had no idea you were pulling it.
Just
So
didn't think what else that might be about.
no, not at all. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, she'd known me since fourth grade, but yeah, but I felt like a freak. I felt like people knew I was at the top of my class in high school. So maybe I was compensating
Mm-hmm.
academically just to be good at something, but I always envied my sister and friends who had full heads of hair, and I didn't know anybody else
Yeah.
that had this.
Did your parents know, or did you living with you and see hair in different places? How did you hide the habit, or did you?
I didn't at home.
Mm.
In the beginning, I wasn't as sophisticated at pulling in secret, and so I would pull watching television with the family. And my mom would usually say, stop pulling, get your hands out of your hair. When it was time to vacuum, it was hard on whoever was vacuuming because usually there were piles of hair
Yeah.
in strategic places, namely on my bed and around the couches in the living room. Eventually, once they kind of nagged me enough, I went in the bathroom to pull. And then pulling got worse because I would stay in the restroom for an hour, and I'd often use tweezers to help me get shorter hairs, because when the hair grows back, of course, it's a lot not healthy and it's much shorter and coarser. And so I'd use the tweezers in the bathroom and just make things so much worse. So once I literally started pulling in the closet in the restroom, or just in bed at night to hide it, I think it got worse.
Isn't that so sad to think about that? In an effort to bring it to your attention, and presumably to try to help you stop. Once your parents sort of called attention to it, he said, "Oh, okay, well, it's apparent, so I'm going to, I don't know if I can stop, but I'm going to do it more in secrecy, and in turn, in secrecy, I can do it even more, sort of intentionally."
Exactly. Yes. And I don't blame my parents. There was no therapy for it at the time, and they were doing a very typical reaction.
Right.
Parents just trying to draw my attention to it and help me stop, but it kind of did the opposite. It drove it into the closet.
So you were doing it more in private over time, which could involve tools and implements, tweezers and stuff, but still found other ways to sort of mask the aftermath in terms of publicly and changing your hairstyle and wearing clips. Yeah.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. And it's sort of a double-edged sword. I'm imagining wearing clips and ornaments in your hair because on one hand, it sort of maybe can cover up or take attention away from places where there's hair missing.
Yes.
But then at the same time, one of the things I know so frequently for people is just the habit of touching one's own hair, if this has been a challenge, or just the impulse to raise one's arm or hand to the head can already be the start of a sort of pulling session. So, if you've got to fiddle around with something in your hair or readjust it, that can sort of be re-triggering. Yeah.
Just checking to make sure it's in the right spot. Yes.
Yeah, I see. So you got through high school. Nobody really knew other than the home environment.
Exactly.
So when you go off to the mainland for college, then you're making a face.
I was petrified because I had a roommate, in college, and was so afraid she'd find out, but she never knew either.
Never knew.
No, and then I started dating my husband my sophomore year of college. He didn't know. I never went to hairdressers, so I thought that would be a sure giveaway to people, but I was too embarrassed to go have anyone professionally work on my hair. When I cut it in high school, I cut it myself. So I did that over the years. I cut my own hair. Sometimes my husband would help me. And my excuse was that I was so Chinese, I didn't want to pay for a hairdresser.
Wow, that's really Chinese. My gosh.
So I literally never went to a hairstylist until I was 32 years old. But that was not even a giveaway to my husband. When we were dating, once we were married, he still just thought I was a very frugal wife.
I see. So, right, throughout your 20s, how old were you when you got married, by the way?
I was 23.
Oh, okay.
And we had been dating for 4 years at that point, and he didn't know. And
Yeah.
I didn't actually tell him until I was 32. So we'd been married 9 years at that point.
Gotcha.
I had 2 children in the meantime. The pulling got so bad.
Really?
With childbirth and pregnancy. There are definitely hormonal links, I believe, to trichotillomania. And so starting around the same time as menstruation started, age 13, which nowadays I understand starts a lot earlier, which explains why maybe some kids are starting with trich earlier now.
Yeah.
Also with each pregnancy and after each childbirth, the pulling was out of control.
Really?
With those hormonal changes, yes.
I see.
And yet still my husband didn't know.
And in some ways that speaks to how good of an undercover agent you were.
Either that, or as some people say, how inobservant he was.
Okay. I'd prefer to give you credit rather than I've never met him, so
yeah, he's a very trusting guy, not suspicious to why my hand was always in my head. But I would usually pull, if he was sitting on the left side of me, I'd pull with the right hand. And even though we'd be sitting there together, he really wouldn't notice. I would never pull right in front of him. So.
It's interesting. You talk about, people talk about sort of genetic links about it. You talk about hormonal changes and how as that seems to be changing in our population in general, perhaps the age of onset, for hair pulling, that seems to be changing in correspondence with it. My understanding is, I mean, they sort of categorize BFRBs and Trich as sort of under the spectrum of OCD, an obsessive compulsive disorder, but I know that my sense is that's definitely not a perfect fit. Some people think of it as kind of like, an addictive behavior, like it's similar to like as you were talking about, I really it's hard to fight the behavior, and the more I do it, the more I want to do it. And then I've got to hide it from my husband. So in that sense, it's similar, but maybe that's not a perfect fit. Some people talk about it as more like a tic disorder or Tourette's. But there's still a lot of developing research and theories about it. What resonates for you?
Well, when I first began receiving treatment, I was placed into an OCD support group. I couldn't relate to the individuals in the group at all. Yeah. So this was through Kaiser in Hawaii, and so I understood that's all that they had available. But there really wasn't a cognitive component to the pulling for me. It wasn't that I was upset about gray hairs and only pulling gray hairs. There wasn't anything real obsessive about it. There was definitely a compulsive or impulsive component. And absolutely, once you get in the habit of pulling, there's a strong habit element, which does look a lot like substance abuse. And so
some of those treatments or cognitive thoughts behind stopping the habit were helpful, such as habit reversal therapy in the beginning, H.E.A.R.T. That was helpful. It raised my awareness of my greatest triggers and most dangerous times for pulling, and allowed me to get creative in thinking of substitute behaviors that I could do, such as watching television, making sure I had a fidget in my hand. Driving a stick shift car was always better for me than driving an automatic.
That's one I haven't thought of.
Because it kept my right hand busy. Things like that. Also, having a cordless phone back then was helpful because I didn't have to sit tethered to a line, but I could keep my hands busy while on the phone.
Right. Anything you can do to keep the hands busy, huh?
I do think that there's more similarity to a tic disorder than to OCD at this point from what I'm reading. But I definitely see where the habit element needs to get addressed as well.
Well, and I think, as you said, is the fact that it feels like it's something that's hard not to do. It feels like a compulsion. Maybe that's where people draw the overlap with something like OCD for a ritual or a hand washing, that kind of thing. But as you said from the start, it wasn't necessarily a fear of something that drove you to pull, or right. It's not that you were avoiding something that you were scared of. You were just kind of bored. And right, for some people, they're just looking for something that's stimulating or activating in that way, perhaps. Yeah,
that's correct.
Yeah.
Boredom and stress are the two common triggers, and so yeah.
You mentioned the genetic component. To your knowledge, is there any similar history in other people in your family?
It's kind of funny, but I realized my dad, who's the Chinese Hawaiian parent, that he never had a razor or shaving kit. And he always had a clean face, no facial hair, but he had tweezers that he kept in different places in the house and also in the car. And he was often waiting for my mom. He was her chauffeur because she chose not to drive. And so he would have the tweezers in his hand and be tweezing facial hair incessantly when we were growing up. And so I don't think I mirrored his behavior consciously, but in hindsight, it's possible that he had some of that behavior or that the disorder in him. Now, it didn't interfere with the activities of daily living, which is one of the criteria for a diagnosis of trichotillomania. It was just something he did.
Sure.
But he never had to shave, and I never thought about that until years later.
I see. Yeah, right. And the argument could be, well, he was just saving time, or he liked to appear well-groomed all the time, and so rather than doing it all at once, he was just constantly tweezing, perhaps. Yeah. So you had kids in your 20s, and you went to law school and everything, and this was something that continued to develop. Really was hard to control, you said, during pregnancy? That's
right, and after I gave birth both times, especially when you're up in the middle of the night so much and you're by yourself. I pulled from the sides of my head quite a bit at that time, and I'd actually never really done as much damage to the sides as I did when they were first born, and I'd be up in the middle of the night feeding them. Yeah.
And how did you, I mean, I'm guessing there was some progression, or you got to a point, as you said, when you were 32, that your husband realized what was happening, or that you decided to tell him?
We'd had a visit from a relative, and she was washing her hands, I thought, obsessively, and drinking kind of ridiculous amounts of water, I thought, obsessively. So I decided to go to the mall and get a mental health handbook and do a little research to see if possibly she had OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. And so I was in the mall bookstore, and my kids were 1.5 and 3.5. And I picked the mental health handbook up. I still have it. And I started to read the chapter on OCD, and there was a little box on one of the pages, little side note box that described a young lady who was pulling out her hair. And of course, my eyes just got huge. And I proceeded to read it right there in the bookstore. And she, like me, had started pulling when she was 13. The pulling behavior, the thoughts around the follicle, the shame and the isolation. I felt like I was reading my own story, and it was a little freaky. Yeah. I remember the room was spinning, and my focus was just on this paragraph or two in this mental health handbook. And so I quickly paid for it and asked my kids if they'd please sit down on a bench when we got outside. Mind you, they were 1.5.
I know. I'm trying to picture that. My kids aren't that much older, and ask them to sit anywhere at all.
Yeah, and quietly. But I was not able to stand. I was in shock, and still the world was spinning, because I realized that I all of a sudden belonged to a community of, from what I was reading, was millions of people, and I thought I was the only one. And now I knew there was a name, And so that was the day, I say 99% of my healing came. And
Wow.
in the back of the book, because it referred me to a national organization, which at the time was called the Trichotillomania Learning Center in Santa Cruz, California.
Mm-hmm.
And they had an address and phone number. This, again, was pre-email, pre-internet.
Couldn't call them on your cell phone at that time, right from the mall, right?
Oh, no, I had to wait till the next day. It was too late in the day to call California. And so I did. I called them first thing in the morning, and I spoke with the founding director of the organization, Christina Pearson. I'll never forget that phone call with Christina. She is a hero for so many of us because she's the first person we ever spoke to about our disorder. And we went from feeling alone and crazy to realizing that there was a name for this and millions in the world, and that there was actually an organization started by a real powerhouse, compassionate, intelligent woman that was changing the way the world looked for all of us. And she gave me a phone number for someone in Hawaii who also had trichotillomania that was willing to be contacted.
Wow.
And she also suggested that I not only call that woman, but that I let my husband know that night. She said she understood my fear of telling him, but she strongly encouraged me that I needed to share with him, which I did that evening. And I sat him down, and I think he thought from the look on my face that I was going to say I had cancer because I was crying and so serious.
Oh, my gosh.
I almost think when I told him, he was relieved, even though he was sad that I felt I had to hide it from him. He's a wonderful Christian husband, unconditionally loves me. I let him know it was nothing about him that made me keep it secret. It was just a habit of secrecy and a lot of shame. And his response was beautiful. He said, he cried with me. And also, I think he was relieved that I didn't have anything more life-threatening.
Right.
And he just said, whatever it takes, I'm going to help you with this, whatever you want me to do.
Yeah. Nicely done. That's the right response, yeah?
Oh, absolutely.
Versus so much of what I frequently hear is, come on, why do you do that? Stop thinking, like, why? Come on, that's embarrassing or that's weird. So good for him to just, and especially at a time, in some ways not that long ago, but when understanding and resources were even more scarce, I have to think, yeah?
That's right.
Yeah.
I do tell people to be careful when they first start coming out of the closet, that they tell people who will educate themselves and be supportive like Ed was. So, yes, of course, then I decided about 2 weeks later that my freedom from the trichotillomania closet of shame was so huge, I had to share it, that I took a chance, and I wanted to meet other people in Hawaii with the disorder. So I had a pager by that time. So I wrote to,
that's great.
I had a pager number. And so I wrote to 3 local TV stations, to their health reporters. And the first one that called me in Hawaii, I agreed to be live in 2 live segments, 5 minutes each, in the Channel 2 morning news in Hawaii. And I went from not even telling my husband for 13 years of our relationship to telling 80,000 households on the morning news in Hawaii what I'd been doing in secret for almost 20 years at that point.
I guess you were ready.
I was ready. I felt that I was chosen, I guess. I gave out my pager number, and according to the news station staff, it was going off like crazy during each of the segments.
Wow.
And out of that, I did garner about 60-something phone numbers and individuals that I spent a week calling afterwards. And then I got that huge privilege of being the first phone call, like Christina Pearson was at TLC. For me, I got to be that first phone call for so many individuals with trichotillomania, parents of children with trichotillomania. And out of that, we started a support group. My husband's in healthcare, so he got us a room at R.R. Army Medical Center and started meeting for about 6 years. We met every month.
Wow. Some people were dealing with it themselves. Other people were concerned family members or parents.
Right. Yes, usually parents, yes, or spouses.
Right. Wow, I'm just thinking, I mean, just as you said, this was a closeted thing for, 20-some years?
Correct.
Oh, about 20 years, and you've got young kids, and just all it took was that, not all it took, but it started with that book, and just seeing that there's a name for this thing, and at that point it was, as you described it, like it was a little box. It was like a little footnote, It's not, it's like a subtype of OCD, and here's this thing, but that Trichotillomania Learning Center got its name and contact info in there. That's a gift. Yeah.
Absolutely. It was definitely what I call a God incident, not a coincidence.
Mm-hmm. And very quickly, you just took that and ran, and as you said, 99% of what you feel to be the healing process was just having a name, knowing that there were resources, feeling like I'm not alone.
I'm starting to help others.
Yes, right. Wow. So, and as you started to connect with others and help other people in Hawaii, run that support group, what did that do for you and your own dealing with the urges and the habit?
Well, I was in therapy at the time, but honestly, again, I think speaking about it regularly, I did other media outreach as well as other stations contacted me, and the Channel 2 Morning News did a follow-up about 2 years later. But really, the monthly meetings and talking about it openly and educating others as well. I contacted TLC, the national organization, and asked if I could get the funding, if they'd be willing to fly to Hawaii and do a conference, because it was pretty expensive for people from Hawaii to fly to their national retreats or conferences. My husband helped me secure funding from a couple of drug companies that were responsible for depression medication, which at the time was the most common thing people with trichotillomania were prescribed. So the companies paid for the doctors to fly out as well as the TLC staff, and we did a one-day conference at R.R. Army Medical Center. And so educating others, coming alongside people with trichotillomania, as well as having a very supportive husband and friends and church were key to my recovery. So I didn't probably completely stop pulling, of course, at that time. But again, I felt 99% of my healing came in just that awareness that I belonged to this community and that this disorder had a name. Whether or not there was a treatment for it, there still apparently isn't. But I knew I could learn to manage it over time. And that was a very hopeful time in my life. So.
I think so. As I hear it, it's the sense of isolation and shame. Yeah, that very quickly felt like, oh, what a relief and freedom. But perhaps the actual changing of the urge, and the actual pulling that sort of came more slowly over time.
That's correct. I would do my therapy as well as do some of the incentives for myself to stop pulling, and I'd have longer and longer stretches of a week or 2 weeks. Then I'd relapse, and so I kind of learned. And in a way, I'm glad that I continued pulling at that time, because I think it helped me stay relevant to the people that I was caring for, to understand and help them process once they started to stop pulling, that relapses don't mean you're back at square one.
Sure.
And so the real sense of failure and beating yourself up when you relapse, I was able to, from personal experience, put that into perspective for the people around me and help them still have hope and still get back into putting their substitute behaviors and raising their awareness, putting their therapy into practice again.
A journey, not a destination, right? I mean, each moment, each day is a fresh one. So
that's right, and we're never back where we started.
I know, yeah. Now, subsequently, once you sort of settled back down in Orange County area, right, is when you started another group.
That's correct. Once I got here in 2004, I asked TLC to do a one-day conference again. They flew down to Southern California, and at that time, my husband was at Miller Children's Hospital, Long Beach Memorial, and so we hosted it there. And out of that, I met about 30 families that were instantly on my list, and we decided to start a support group right away. And so January of 2005, I decided to do this support group for children and teenagers instead of adults. One thing I learned in my Hawaii support group was that mixing children and adults was tricky, pardon the pun. But the children with trich, especially nowadays, I think in a lot of ways have a different disorder than those of us who've been pulling for decades, in the sense that they don't have the shame at the same level. And once they join a support group, they don't have the isolation at the same level. And
why do you suppose that is? Do you think it's just general awareness being more, a different generation around mental health and emotional concerns?
Exactly. Yeah. I think because parents access support, and now the internet is available. There are even support groups online. Yeah. And so I think those of us that had trichotillomania for decades, in a way, have what I call trich plus disorder. We have trich plus shame, trich plus the isolation. And so to really put therapy to good use, we have to dig out first from piles of shame and isolation. Yeah. And that can take years, and then we learn to stop pulling. Whereas I believe the children who are diagnosed these days, because so much information is out there and there's so much more awareness, I believe they're able to avoid a lot of the shame and isolation aspects of the disorder. And so mixing those of us that have had it for decades with these young, sweet children and teenagers isn't the best mix. Sure. And honestly, for a lot of the parents, the best I can do for a child or a teen is to help their parents kind of calm down about their child's trichotillomania or dermatillomania. We do have kids and teens in our group who are skin pickers as well as hair pullers, and or both. If I can help their parents put it into perspective and kind of calm down and understand that it's something manageable over time. It's nothing that they did wrong to cause their child to have it. They can definitely make it worse if they push too hard or bring too much attention to it. But the way I say, the parents who come to my support group regularly, those are the rock star parents, because they understand that peer support is the best medicine for their child, and normalizing the disorder for their child, giving them the monthly place to talk about it with other kids and teens is the best medicine possible.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. Obviously, maintaining respect for everyone's privacy, but can you talk about sort of what kinds of things you do in the group, what you've been doing over time, and what you've learned from them, and talking with so many teens and youth that have been dealing with these kinds of issues?
Well, I call them my heroes because unlike me, who stayed in the closet for almost 20 years, most of our students are writing reports on this, giving oral presentations on trichotillomania. Wow. They're willing to be photographed. They're willing to be filmed. At one point, we were on 2020, and we had our normal support group meeting, but then the 6 or 9 of us that were willing to be on 2020 stayed and did a whole nother support group session with bright lights and microphones in their faces, and they were so desperate to educate others about their disorder. So I learned so much from them. Our group is called H.E.A.R.T, and it's an acronym that stands, not perfect acronym, but it stands for Helping Educate and Reach Out to Tricksters, H.E.A.R.T. And so one of our purposes from early on has been that they don't only want to give each other support, but they want to educate the people that still don't come to our group. Mm-hmm. Make sure that they find out they're not alone. And so we even produced a DVD early on in 2005 that has been viewed on YouTube now thousands of times. And I understand you actually
That's right.
saw it at a training venue. So we're very happy to know that it's out there. It was a labor of love for the parents that worked on it and the kids who are willing to reveal their secret and have their images on a DVD that's still being viewed, 12 years later.
That's right.
So that they're my heroes. I feel what we do during our meeting times, and we've done this on the videos and on 2020, is we go around and we just talk about who we are and where we pull from, because not everybody pulls from the same spot or picks from the same spot. And we share how the month has been with regards to the disorder. If it was a good month, we ask each other, why do you think it was a good month? Mm-hmm. Was there anything you did differently? If it was a bad month, we try to explore why it might have been a bad month.
Yeah. We
also share where we go to school and how long we've been pulling, and usually a fun question like, what's kind of pets do you have, or what's the last movie you saw? Because I don't want the kids to think that they are their trichotillomania. Right, they're kids. Right. Their trick is what they do. It's not who they are.
Sure.
Then the other important thing that we do is always have a craft going while we're talking. Because I personally hated my hands when I was growing up. And all those years that I had trichotillomania in secret, I viewed my hands as my enemies. And what I want the kids to understand from very early is that their hands can create beauty, and their hands can be used for creativity and for good things.
Yeah.
And so we are always doing something with our hands, craft or drawing, or one year we learned sign language to their favorite song.
Was that mutually agreed upon what the favorite song was?
Yeah, it was that cute song from about 12 years ago or 10 years ago called You Had a Bad Day or Bad Day.
Oh, that's right. Yes.
We often, we refer to bad days of pulling as bad hair days.
Right.
Literally.
Well, and isn't there that there was another movie TLC put out, Bad Hair Life, right?
That's right. Bad Hair Life. So, yep. So we learned sign language to that song. So whenever it came on the radio, we could at least stop pulling and do the sign language for that.
Gotcha. Well, that's a real gift that, well, as I hear it, it's certainly a gift to you, to see these youngsters dealing with it. And I'm sure you have a big heart for them, no pun intended, just but having gone through it yourself. But also it's a real gift that you offer them, being of a different generation when the resources and the awareness and, the stigma was very different. So it's great that you're able to do that for them. You and I had a conversation before kind of about the kinds of people that come to the group or that, are open to attending something like this, ethnicity-wise, gender-wise. What kind of folks are typically open to this kind of help?
Well, the lion's share of the people who reach out to me through email, primarily about the H.E.A.R.T group and who actually attend, are Caucasian. And then most of them are parents of daughters. I've, in 12 and a half years, probably only had 4 boys attend the group of different ages, probably age 8 through about 16 years old. When they do come, they're very popular. The girls love it. And I think the parents of the boys worry about that.
Right.
But there's an instant bond, obviously.
I see.
But ethnicity-wise, generally the Hispanic community reaches out through social workers. And so most of the contact from the Hispanic community has come through agencies.
I see.
So I'm grateful that our name's out there. We do have parents who are bilingual, Spanish, English, and so it's wonderful to be able to have their parents attend as well and participate in the parent group that meets simultaneously. Over the years, however, being an Asian American, I have only had one Asian family participate for about 3 months. And when they stopped coming, I reached out after a month or two and said, hey, I've missed you and missed your daughter. And they indicated that they were worried her pulling might get worse because other kids had it worse in the group, so to speak. And they said they were just going to keep her busy and that she was pulling less. My experience, though, when people stop coming is that they often reach out to me for years later to say that their child's pulling returned with a vengeance. Yeah. Trichotillomania and dermatillomania, they do ebb and flow, and the urges are greater for some kids and teens, again, hormonally related, as well as time of day and times of year, vacation or not vacation. Right. And so typically it never completely goes away if they haven't done some hard work to learn how to manage their pulling. And so I'm concerned that I've only had the one Asian family in all these years. That's disheartening. My experience with the Asian community, my husband being Chinese also, is that mental health issues in general are not addressed because there's a lack of understanding as well as a lot of shame surrounding mental health and even physical health disorders, but definitely mental health disorders.
Oh, preaching to the choir there.
Yeah.
And a lot we could say about that. But, I'm thinking about that. It's almost like this idea from that family that, somehow is someone going to be more likely to pull because they're around other people who do it as well or do it more, that somehow there's this contagious aspect of it.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, but from what you're saying and to my understanding and what I see is, it's very much the opposite, right? That, it's not a matter of, there's someone else who has it, worse than me, that I'm going to be influenced negatively by that. If anything, you talk with other people, you can relate, and again, it's you maybe get other ideas and perspectives on how to feel like you're part of a community and how to handle it differently.
That's right. Some of the students who graduate from my group, they're in college now, and obviously some are 23 and 24 years old now, and they're doing amazing things for the world. Many of them are out of the closet and still educating people. And so I really think the parents who bring their children to H.E.A.R.T over the years are doing the best thing they can. Yeah. They're really empowering their children to own their disorder. They're giving them a regular, safe place to talk about it. I host pool parties and slumber parties for the kids because pool parties and slumber parties, generally the kids, myself included, when I was young, avoided those settings because that's where your trick might get discovered if eyelashes rub off the pool or if a bald spot is revealed in the middle of the night.
Or you get in the pool and, if your hair comes out looking a little different.
Yep. Or if a wig comes off in the pool. So, so those kinds of experiences that we give them at H.E.A.R.T, even, riding roller coasters is scary. So even going on roller coasters together and doing things that we typically avoid, but there's strength in numbers.
Sure.
And I think those experiences have really helped a lot of them to move into adulthood and become very strong. Oh, yeah. Mostly women. And I still keep in touch with almost all of them. And it's just a joy. I always tell them once they're a graduate from H.E.A.R.T, they are always welcome back.
They're alumni, part of the alumni network.
Yeah, exactly.
Real gift that you've been able to be part of that for them, and I'm sure connect them with each other too.
Yeah.
Yeah, and especially, again, there's still pockets and areas where it's an uphill battle. I remember you telling me that Dr. Phil had an episode talking about trick and kind of wasn't too accurate or sensitive in how he was advising someone, correct?
That's right. I think it was in 2005 that he had an episode with a mom on where her daughter was pulling her hair and pulling her Barbie doll's hair, and so he advised the mother to intervene with punishment, with negative reinforcement each time in order to get her to stop. She was very young, so she might have had what's called baby trick or pediatric trick. But regardless, when I showed that episode to the parents first and then got their permission to show it to the kids next door, we were astounded.
Oh, gosh, yeah.
Absolutely positive reinforcement and cheerleading. I tell the parents the best thing you can do for your child is to give them unconditional love and be their best cheerleader in the world. And it doesn't mean it doesn't affect the parents. They're deeply affected and they're frustrated and they're sometimes angry, sad. But I tell them that's why you come to support group. You come and you scream and cry and pound your fist on the table, and then you get back out there and be the best mom and dad cheerleader possible for your child to really combat a lot of the wrong information like Dr. Phil had on his television show.
Oh, gosh, yeah. Well, and I think that principle applies for so many things. There's so many ideas out there about parenting on so many kinds of things, so many behaviors and habits. But, I'm with you. And if there's a place to fall back to, we want to stay positive, want to stay rewarding, want to stay encouraging and supportive. And it's amazing how often that message needs to be repeated, Yeah,
absolutely.
Are there other resources that would be good for people to know about regarding either your group or if people have follow-up questions for you, Nalani, or just other resources about Trichotillomania and BFRBs?
Sure. Well, the national organization that I first found 20 years ago is still around. It's been renamed to reflect growing knowledge of the fact that trichotillomania is a body-focused repetitive behavior disorder, a BFRB, as you stated at the top. And so now the organization is called the TLC Foundation for BFRBs. And their website is pretty easy to remember. It's now www.bfrb.org, standing for Body Focused Repetitive Behavior.org.
Great. And do you have a formal role with BFRB, by the way, with bfrb.org?
No, I've chosen, because I was raising children and busy with church, I've chosen to focus my volunteer energy on the local support group.
Gotcha.
We continue to be the only support group for children in the country, H.E.A.R.T.
Wow.
That has at least that stuck around this long. And so, I've spoken or presented at events before, and I like to partner with them when they do their one-day workshops nearby. And I fundraise. Our H.E.A.R.T group fundraises for them every October during Awareness Week.
Cool.
BFRB Awareness Week. They're run on what I would consider to be an extremely small staff for the amount of impact on the amount of lives that they impact.
I've noticed that.
And so extremely well-run organization. And so I try to do whatever I can to make sure people join as members to support their work. They have conferences, one coming up in April of 2017, and I believe the next one will be in San Francisco next April. So I hope to get involved in that one. When it's nearby, I try to volunteer as well and get my H.E.A.R.T families to volunteer.
Cool. Yes, and they also have professional trainings for mental health professionals. The Practice Training Institute, which I've been through a number of years ago with Dr. Mansueto, and it was a phenomenal, really, really well done training. So it's great that they're out there doing things like that too. Yeah.
Yes, and they have a scientific research arm as well now, and so for years, and so they are really on the cutting edge of trying to understand what causes trichotillomania, and eventually, hopefully, to find a cure for it.
Yeah.
And I tell parents, you need to join, because who else is going to join this organization but those of us that have been impacted by trichotillomania and dermatillomania.
Right. So. Any other resources, links, books you want to highlight that would be good for people to know about?
Yeah, for families in particular, since that is kind of my specialty now.
Yeah.
There's kind of the big blue book, we call it, the hair pulling habit and you, I believe. It's available on the BFRB website. I think that's the best resource that a parent can purchase and provide to a therapist. I don't recommend parents be their child's therapist. Again, I think they should be their child's cheerleader.
Sure.
And so it's a good way to educate yourself and then pass it on to the therapist and see if a therapist will work some of the habit reversal and cognitive behavioral therapy principles, even if they've never treated trick before.
Mm-hmm.
Even a school counselor, I believe, could be invaluable. Definitely a therapist in helping to treat and work with a child on that, the principles in that book by Ruth Gollum and Sherry Vavracek.
All right. Some tools are better than none, and some people haven't had much formal experience or training, as we said.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So that's a terrific resource. Then there's a book for parents that helps them calm down. It used to be called Stay Out of My Hair. I don't remember the current name, but it's also by Dr. Vavracek and Suzanne Moten Odom of the TLC Foundation, who are therapists that treat individuals with trick. And that book is really geared for parents. I think it might now be called The Parent's Handbook to Trichotillomania, although I thought Stay Out of My Hair was a great name because that's what the children want.
Yeah, right. A lot of people without trichotillomania don't want that from their parents too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it's a great book to cast vision and hope.
Nice.
And also for parents who are new to this, to really help them calm down, take a deep breath,
Yeah.
and understand the best things that they can do for their
Gotcha.
child.
And Nalani, other specific messages that you would have either for youth, anyone who's listening who may be dealing with trichotillomania and hasn't had, targeted attention or support, and or for any parents or family members, perhaps. Any other messages you'd want to leave them with?
Well, there's really no shortage nowadays, unlike when I first discovered I had trichotillomania, no shortage of resources online. If you live in certain metropolitan areas or areas where people like myself have been willing to start support groups,
Right.
You can find those face-to-face groups by looking at BFRB.org and clicking on the link for Find Support. And that will have the in-person support groups. They're in many states and in many cities, mostly metropolitan areas, though.
Yep.
And then online, there are email-based groups, there are chat rooms, there are a growing number of Facebook-based support groups that are closed or secret that you can join, and communities for not just people with trichotillomania, adults and teens, but also for parents. There's a group on Facebook that many of my parents belong to called Tricky Parenting, and they give each other wonderful support. I definitely recommend an in-person conference or retreat as well.
Through the TLC Foundation for BFRBs, at least once early on in your diagnosis and reaching out and educating yourself. Once you've gone to one of those, you will not look at your life or your disorder or the world, frankly, the same.
I have to imagine, yeah.
Oh, the power of being in a room of people that share your experience. You can't put a price tag on that. And
especially if you've spent decades keeping it to yourself, as you said.
Keeping it to yourself, and if you're like me, not even going to a hairdresser. I figure all those years I didn't spend anything on my hair. It was worth it. The money that it costs to get to these retreats and conferences, absolutely worth it. And then eventually getting involved in helping others who are new to the community too. That was very powerful.
Sure. Well, I am glad that you're now a Chinese person with the freedom and budget to go to the hairdresser.
I'm more than making up for those years I held back on spending. Much to my husband's chagrin now.
Okay. Well, at least there's a different set of issues, right?
Yeah.
But no, I really appreciate your time and being willing to talk so openly about your personal journey with this, from inception to years of really being isolated and in the dark with it, to really now being able to do something so beautiful and helping people kind of blossom and deal with this in the company of others, and that's a real gift. And it's a gift to have you be able to talk about it here on the show with me. So thank you again.
It's really my honor. I thank you, Martin.
Pleasure. All right, Nalani, we will be back in touch at some point. So thank you for talking with us today.
In the meantime, aloha.
Aloha and mahalo.
Take care.
Well, there you have it. And so if you're someone listening who has dealt with trichotillomania or excoriation, skin picking, you know you're not alone. You've got company. And we also heard about some really great resources and forums to get help with this. So I will have all these listed online if you want to visit the show notes for episode 26 at psychrallypodcast.com. Or you can share the episode link with anyone you know who might be interested or know someone who's dealing with this. So it was, I have to say, just really fun and easy to talk with my guest and friend, Noelani. She really has such a warm and positive character. It's, it's unfortunate that she had to deal with this in silence and isolation for so many years. And yet, in some ways, it's actually kind of fitting that someone like her would have the experience and understanding to extend herself now and help so many people and families afflicted with trich, and also have her story be available here for others to listen in on. A couple of other quick thoughts to highlight. For any parents listening, if your child is having a hard time with hair pulling, it really can be such a tricky, I was going to say tricky balance, no pun intended, but it is a tricky balance, knowing how much to intervene and, whether to point it out when you see your child doing it or to suggest alternative habits, things they can do to busy themselves instead of pulling. We talked about this. So I think sometimes it's important to just bear in mind that some kids may not be in a place yet where they want it pointed out. And I think sometimes they really have to wrestle with the habit as well as that shame and embarrassment we mentioned earlier. They may have to wrestle with it on their own for a while before they accept help from you or a professional. So in my experience, those good parental intentions sometimes just need to be acted on with caution and sensitivity and patience when it comes to trich. And your kid will let you know what's helpful and what's not at a given time. And again, certainly punishment for pulling, that's not really what we're shooting for or what most people would advise. Another thing to highlight is for physicians, in particular pediatricians, there's a lot of research or reporting I remember hearing that trich is something that is really, really infrequently asked about during physical exams. And, while on one hand, you might think it's really a problem that would be visible and apparent if you bring a kid into the doctor's office and there's patches of hair missing. But as Nalani shared, there are certainly many artful ways to hide a habit like this. So, just an encouragement to pediatricians or physicians that work with a lot of kids or PAs to be in the know about trich and at least to think to screen or ask about it if possible. And just like for others, not to assume that it's easy to just stop or prescribe a medication for. It can be a much longer process. And one other point I wanted to make, again, from my experience, is that someone who pulls their hair or deals with a BFRB, quality of life can improve even without total remission of the habit, even without totally stopping pulling or picking, right? I mean, so much of what allowed Nalani to move forward and feel more whole was just the normalizing and naming of what she was struggling with before she actually was able to stop. So, the definition of a successful recovery or a successful treatment outcome when it comes to coping and recovery from trich can vary. And, the amount of hair someone pulls often may not be the only measure of how much distress someone is experiencing. Yeah. And I say this because a lot of people can get to a place of accepting themselves and their appearance, even when they still struggle with pulling at times. And it can certainly be a long journey with ups and downs. So anyways, glad to be able to talk about this here on the show. I would love to hear your thoughts and reactions, your own stories or experiences with this. I can be reached at martin@psychrallypodcast.com, or you can visit our practice website, cbtsocal.com. And thank you again to my guest, Noelani Jai, and thank you for listening in to Psych Rally.